Hermanos y hermanas, si nosotros leemos el libro de Levítico, la mayoría nosotros escuchamos es los sacrificios varios, de amistad, por el pecado, por la paz, ofrendas de los animales y los granos y otras cosas con la asociación del templo. Entonces, es claro, probablemente los sacerdotes del templo escribiendo este libro, y entonces nosotros tenemos una idea qué es las acciones en el tiempo bíblico. My sisters and brothers, if you go back and you read the book of Leviticus, most of what you will find there is what was happening in the temple. So you can read about sin offerings and peace offerings and friendship offerings and offerings of cereal and offerings of animals and how worship was to be done in the temple. And we have all of these directions of what was to be done and not done and where the incense altars were and how big the altars were to be and all of these kinds of things. And so we have a good sense then that book was written probably by the priests who worked in the temple. And one of the reasons that book is so important to us is it's one of the few written records we have of what was happening in the temple. How did the people at that time worship? We don't have many extant records, so Leviticus is very important for that reason. But it also goes on to talk about what does it mean to be in this worshiping community? What is the implication of being a part of this community of Israel? En el Levítico nosotros escuchamos no solamente las direcciones por el sacrificio, mas también la implicación de esas acciones. Levítico continúa no solamente en los sacrificios, mas también que es necesario de hacer parte de esta comunidad de Israel, que es las acciones en nuestras vidas, afuera del templo, importante. Y nosotros escuchamos un punto importante cuando él escribiendo sigue, ama a su prójimo como a ti mismo, yo soy el Señor. Ama a tu prójimo, nosotros pensamos frecuentemente del Nuevo Testamento, mas también es un punto fundamental de la comunidad de Israel. Entonces, es una fundación por nosotros también. También nosotros escuchamos, sean santos, porque yo, el Señor, soy santo. Esto también es un punto fundamental de la entidad de Israel. Pero nosotros debemos comprender esa sensibilidad de santo correctamente para ayudarnos en la vida práctica. We hear in today's reading two fundamental points of how Israel is to understand itself. And one is, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Unless you think that was new to Jesus or the New Testament. Nope, it's right there, beginning of the Bible. So it's a fundamental point of how Israel should understand itself. The sacred writer also says, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now, it's important that if we understand this correctly, then we'll understand why it matters in our daily life, and we can put it into practice. Cuando nosotros escuchamos, ama a su prójimo, esto es claro a nosotros, yo espero, de las acciones en el catequismo, es claro también en el Evangelio. Mas la santidad, nosotros tenemos una tentación de limitar santidad a solamente esas cosas en la iglesia. Y no pensamos de la natura de santo y consagrado. En realidad son dos cosas diferentes. La palabra que nosotros usamos como santo, en realidad también una raíz de santidad y también completa. Las cosas es insieme, es la misma. Entonces, cuando nosotros hablamos de Dios es santo, entiendo no solamente en el senso culto o de Eucaristía es santo, mas también Dios es completa. Nada es falta. Dios es completa y acta completamente. Esto es la santidad de Dios. Y la acción de Dios también es completa. Es un punto filosófico importante. Por nosotros realizamos cuál es el punto de Dios en esta sentencia. I would hope that when we hear you are to love your neighbor as yourself, we are all well catechized enough in the gospel and the catechism to know what it is we should be about. We hear those things over and over in the New Testament, Jesus teaching us what it means to put the love of neighbor into practice. But where we get into trouble is this statement, be holy as I am holy, be holy as the Lord your God is holy, because we have a temptation to limit what we mean by holiness. There is the temptation to limit holiness only to those things that belong to the altar or the church in the sense of consecration. And that's a little bit of a misnomer. And it overly limits the concept of sanctity as it is found in both Greek and Hebrew. Both languages use the word holy to also have the same root as something that is holy, H-O-L-Y, in the sense of sacred, but also whole, W-H-O-L-E. They have the same root. So when we talk about God, we say that God is whole, W-H-O-L-E. God is complete. There is nothing lacking. So for example, how many gods are there? Okay, this is the kind of silence that makes me nervous. Let's try again. How many gods are there? One. And so when we say there is one God, is there any divinity running around looking for a God to attach itself to? No, because God is complete. Nothing is lacking. And when we hear this nothing lacking, what we hear is that God is also acting. God is pure act. St. Thomas Aquinas will say, God is literally pure being. Es importante cuando nosotros pensamos de la que Dios es completa en Dios, es un punto mismo San Tomás de Aquino diga, Dios es acción. Dios es acción completamente. Y Dios siempre es en acción. Entonces, cuando nosotros escuchamos, sean santos como porque yo el Señor es santo, nosotros también tenemos el mismo. Nosotros no solo consagrados en acción sagrados, contrario del pecado, mas también que nosotros somos in acto como Dios. Nosotros actamos con Dios en nuestro mundo. Nosotros no actamos afuera de Dios o en contrario de Dios, mas actamos con Dios, concretamente en el mundo. When we hear this phrase, be holy as I am holy, we have to see ourselves not only called to sanctity, in the sense of the altar, in the sense that we are to avoid those things that are sinful, but also we are called to God. Not outside of God, not apart from God, not contrary to God, but to be active participants in what God is doing in our world. That we are not passive observers of God's action, we are active participants cooperating with the work of God. And when we think of sanctity in this way, what Jesus says to us in the gospel will make much more sense. Because in the last weeks, we have been hearing from the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus begins with the Beatitudes that we know so well. He goes on to talk about us as salt and light in the world. Both of those readings intended to orientate us and give us a direction towards which we will be acting, the way in which we exist in the world. After Jesus does that, he starts to expand on the Ten Commandments and how is it we are living, how is it we are doing, how is it we are acting as this community that Jesus calls together. Durante estas semanas nosotros escuchamos el sermón en la montaña. Y nosotros comencemos con los beatitudines. Después de los beatitudines nosotros escuchamos, tú eres el sal, tú eres la luz del mundo. Y estas dos partes son una orientación por los creyentes en el mundo. ¿Cuál es la orientación de la persona? ¿Cuál es la orientación de esta vida cristiana? ¿Cuál es la orientación de ir en la dirección de Dios? Después de esto, nosotros escuchamos a Jesús diga de los mandamientos y crea un grande espacio por la vida concretamente. ¿Cuál es la intención de los mandamientos? ¿Cuáles son las acciones concretas en el mundo? ¿Cuáles son las acciones de esta comunidad de creyentes prácticamente en nuestro mundo? Entonces, nosotros podemos comprender que Jesús diga cuando Él diga, ama a su prójima. Y nosotros podemos también comprender, ustedes sean perfectos como su Padre Celestial es perfecto. It is when we understand what we've been hearing that we will make much more sense of Jesus' statement, be perfect as your Father is perfect. Remember, we begin the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, and then the parable of you are the salt, you are the light of the world. Both of those are there to orientate us to what it means to be Christian, to be a part of this believing community. And it's by orientating us correctly that we then start to act with God is asking of us. Jesus first teaches us how we are to be, then he goes on to teach what we are to do, expanding on the Ten Commandments and how we put those into practice, what our Christian life looks like day to day, what it is we are to be about doing day after day. And if we understand those things, then it makes much more sense to say, be perfect as your Father is perfect. The temptation we have in English is to misunderstand the word perfect, the same temptation we have with holy. So we get in this mindset that a perfect is like 100% on a test. So if I were to ask you, any golfers among us? You want to play golf? Some of you, maybe. What is a perfect golf game? What would be a perfect score? One hole, 18 strokes of the ball, right? 18 holes in one would be a perfect game. Anyone play baseball? In theory, how many times in a perfect game would they throw the ball? 27, right? 3 strikes, 9 innings, boom. We have the mentality that that's perfection. That's not the biblical sense of the word. Perfection comes per fecare, for the doing. Hermanos y hermanas, la palabra perfecto, nosotros tenemos una tentación de pensar de es un 100% en un examen, o cuando nosotros hacemos una cosa sin error. En este senso es incorrecto el senso bíblico. El senso bíblico es más en relación per hacer, por hago cosa. Entonces, cuando nosotros escuchamos perfecto, como tu Padre eres perfecto, es una palabra en relación de acción. Es en relación de el verbo hacer. Porque nosotros escuchamos, diga Jesús, el Señor causa su sol, hace en los buenos y los malos, el llueve en los justos y los injustos. Dios haga por la buena a todos, no solamente parcial y no por pocos que ya ama el Señor. El Señor acta por todos y por el bien de todos. En este senso, Dios es perfecto. Y esta es la acción nosotros tenemos también imitar. Nosotros también haga por el mundo. Nosotros hagamos por el bien de la comunidad. Nosotros hagamos no solamente por nuestros hermanos o amigos, mas a todos. En este senso, nosotros entramos en la perfección de Dios. Y nosotros participamos concretamente en la acción de Dios en nuestro mundo. Jesus says to his disciples, be like your Father in heaven, for God makes the sun to shine on the good and the bad. He causes rain to fall for the just and the unjust. In this way, God is perfect because God is acting always for the good of all, not for the good of some. And it's this concrete good for all that we are being called into as well. Notice, not for those only who love us or those we happen to like. But to act in perfectness is to act as God does, which is to act for the good of all. And it's that perfection which Jesus is calling us to. Jesus isn't asking us to score 100 on a test. Jesus is asking us to enter into a way of being and acting that is good for all, for the entire community, not just some. And it's that perfection to which we are being called as a human community. We hear when St. Paul writes to the Corinthians that we ourselves are the temple of God, and that God is inhabiting us. It is to this way of being that St. Paul points us to and lets us understand how it is that we ourselves can then participate in these things. It's not because we are separated from God, but on the contrary, that God is close to us and has made us the temple of God, God's presence, and place of encounter in our world. Nosotros escuchamos en la palabra de San Pablo que nosotros somos los templos de Dios. Nosotros somos la locación que la gente encuentra a Dios, porque la gente encuentra a Dios en nosotros. Nosotros somos la locación de la gente que recibe el amor concreto de Dios. Nosotros somos la gente que ama en el nombre del Señor en nuestro mundo. Nosotros somos los agentes de cambiar en nuestro mundo. Y por eso nosotros digamos, nosotros podemos actuar con Dios concretamente. Es por nuestra fe nosotros podemos hacer esto en un modo concreto. Y como nosotros comencemos la cuaresma en miércoles, nosotros podemos recordar estas palabras de Jesús. Y durante la cuaresma, acta más y más concretamente en el amor de Dios y las acciones de Dios. Nosotros podemos recordar, nosotros tenemos un llamar de Dios de acta con Dios. Y durante la cuaresma nosotros apremos nuestros corazones, cambia nuestras acciones, convertir nuestros corazones, no para regresar después de la cuaresma, mas a cambiar concretamente y acta más concretamente en el amor de Dios en nuestro mundo. It is because we are the temples of the Holy Spirit, my sisters and brothers, that we are the people that God uses to bring His love into the world. We are the agents of change God sends into the world so that people encounter in a real and concrete way the love of God, the love of the church. We are the ones God is sending out. We are the ones where people will encounter the love of God. We are all getting ready, of course, for Ash Wednesday. We remember, of course, Lent starts on Wednesday. And these are good readings for us to start with and ponder as we begin to get ready for Lent, because we're being called during Lent to get rid of those things, to change our hearts, to change our lives, not to go back to old ways of living, but to open ourselves up to a new way of being, a new way of acting, a new way of doing Christianity in our world. And at its base, that's what Lent is calling us to. It's calling us to be more perfect, more in act, more doing as God is doing in our world. And by allowing ourselves to be converted, by allowing ourselves to give something up, we open up our hearts and our lives so that as we go through Lent, we arrive at Easter as a people who are more like God, who are more acting with God, who are more cooperating with God to change our world and to build the reign of the Sacred Heart in souls and societies.